On the morning of April 19, 2023, in the Indian town of Alwar, an 82-year-old retired railway worker, Shivdayal Sharma, was relieving himself next to a train track until suddenly something struck him with brutal force. To your surprise, it wasn't a train at all, but a cow, which had just been hit by a high-speed Vande Bharat Express, launched 30 meters through the air and slammed straight into the man. And while the fate of the poor animal remains unknown, Shivdayal Sharma was instantly killed upon impact. This is just one of 13 tragic and, at the same time, so absurd, so inexplicably dumb, real-life cases where people lost their lives in ways you wouldn't even believe. But first, as always, viewer discretion is advised. On November 25, 2000, locals gathered for a community festival, lining the sidewalks as music blasted from loudspeakers and floats rolled slowly through the streets of Shepparton, Australia. But just behind one of the slower-moving utility trucks, a 20-year-old man from Cranbourne was attempting something extraordinary. Wearing a sombrero and clutching a beer can, he tied a rope to the truck's rear bumper. With a sheet of cardboard beneath him, the man crouched low, held tight, and let the truck drag him down the street like he was surfing asphalt. And, surprisingly, it worked. For a few glorious seconds, the cardboard slid. The man kept his balance, and the crowd literally roared in awe. But then the rope slackened, twisted slightly beneath the chassis, and eventually snagged on something. In one sudden, violent jolt, it yanked the man forward and flung his body directly beneath the rear wheels. By the time the truck rolled to a stop a few meters ahead, it was already far too late. The man's lifeless, mangled body already lay beside the torn cardboard and the crumpled sombrero, which had landed just nearby. This was one of those cases where an intended trick went horrifically wrong, and the next one didn't end well either. On June of 2017, in a small town in Minnesota, 22-year-old Pedro Ruiz III and his 19-year-old girlfriend, Mona Lisa Perez, stood side by side in front of a camera. The couple was about to film a stunt for their growing YouTube channel, one that, according to Pedro, would finally make them famous. The plan was as dangerous as it was absurd. Pedro would hold a thick hardcover book against his chest, a 4-centimeter encyclopedia, and Mona Lisa would fire from a Desert Eagle .50 caliber pistol. He believed, confidently, that the book would stop the bullet. However, there was no second take, and the moment she pulled the trigger, the bullet tore straight through the pages and right into Pedro's chest. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the man never stood a chance and was pronounced dead at the scene. Later, prosecutors revealed that Mona Lisa had been hesitant. She'd even tweeted about the stunt beforehand, writing, "Me and Pedro are probably going to shoot one of the most dangerous videos ever. His idea, not mine." Still, she was ultimately convicted of second-degree manslaughter and served 6 months in jail for the trick that turned extremely deadly. The next man also did something absurdly reckless, but this time it happened deep in the wilderness. In the dense woods of Elk County, Pennsylvania, the late autumn chill had already settled in. It was November 24th, 1906, the height of bear season. But 18-year-old John Decht was hunting solo that morning when he suddenly spotted what he believed to be his prize, a massive black bear sprawled across the forest floor, motionless. To any other hunter, the scene might have raised suspicion, but John assumed the animal had already been shot, perhaps by someone else who hadn't bothered to claim it. So he slung his rifle over his back, took out his blade, and got to work. He began slicing through the fur near the bear's belly, preparing to skin the carcass. And that's when the predator suddenly moved. Without warning, the dead bear jolted awake, and within seconds it lashed out with full force. Caught completely off guard, John didn't have time to reach for his weapon. The animal lunged, tearing into him, and in the end, it quite literally ripped the young man to pieces before calmly lying back down to rest again. By the way, later, forest rangers speculate that the bear had indeed been shot earlier, but not fatally. It had likely passed out from blood loss until John's blade brought it back to life. But the man from the next case didn't wake up a forest predator. He provoked something far smaller, yet just as deadly. On a January morning in 2011, the fields outside Tulare County, California, were stirring with the sounds of an illegal gathering. Dozens of men stood in a dusty ring, cheering, placing bets, and watching two roosters, each armed with razor-sharp blades strapped to their legs, locked in a vicious fight. Among the crowd was 35-year-old Jose Luis Ochoa, a local man who, according to court records, had previously been cited for owning and training fighting birds. But on this particular day, fate came straight at him. At some point during the event, one of the roosters broke free from the pit, disoriented and agitated. It darted into the crowd, and in the chaos, it lashed out, the blade on its leg slicing deep into Jose's lower calf, severing an artery. The man was rushed to the nearest hospital and was eventually pronounced dead 2 hours later. Jose simply underestimated the danger and ultimately lost his life in one of the most absurd ways imaginable. And yet the same could be said for the woman in our next case. On September 29, 2024, off the coast of Sao Paulo State, Brazil, a yacht party had just ended, but for 6 social media influencers, the real adventure was only beginning. The group decided to board a small speedboat to head back to the mainland. As the boat pulled away from the rocky cove, a notorious spot known locally as Devil's Throat, a sudden wave struck. The vessel tipped sideways, and within seconds, it capsized. Of the 6 people on board, 4 passengers and the captain managed to cling to floating debris, but 37-year-old Aline Tamara Morieta de Amorem and 27-year-old Beatriz Tavares de Silva Faria were nowhere to be seen. Further investigation revealed the boat had originally been rated for 5 people, not 7. Worse still, neither Aline nor Beatrice could swim, and when the captain had urged them to wear life jackets at the start of the ride, both refused, claiming the vests would impede their tanning and ruin their outfits for the selfies that they eventually never got the chance to post. The next tragedy also happened in water, but not in the ocean, in a bathtub. And this time, drowning wasn't even the cause. When the family of a 45-year-old woman opened the bathroom door, they froze in horror. Inside the tub was their motionless relative, fully submerged in a clear liquid with her eyes still open. But when the medical examiner arrived, the shock only deepened. The woman hadn't drowned, and the bathtub itself wasn't filled with water, but with alcohol. During the height of the SARS outbreak in Taiwan in 2004, health paranoia was widespread. Rumors and folk remedies circulated quickly, and one of them claimed that soaking in alcohol could disinfect the body and keep the virus away. So the woman filled her bathtub with ethanol at a 40% concentration and stayed inside for more than 12 hours, from 11 p.m. to 11 a.m. By the time her family checked on her the next morning, she had already died from cardiac arrest triggered by an astronomically high blood alcohol concentration of 1.35%. For context, anything above 0.4% is already considered potentially fatal. It turns out that alcohol-related experiences sometimes end in tragedy, and not just this one, but the next case as well. Deep in the slums of Tondo, Manila, 3 friends sat in a cramped, windowless room, sharing jokes, clinking glasses with something they called homemade liquor. It was April 2020, the height of lockdown season. The city was under strict prohibition, and real alcohol was nowhere to be found. So they made their own, mixing instant coffee, soft drinks, vinegar, and for an extra kick, one of them added a splash of paint thinner. By morning, 2 of the men were dead. The third was convulsing, barely breathing, with foam pouring out the corners of his mouth. Authorities later confirmed it was a textbook case of methanol poisoning, the kind that doesn't just shut down your liver, but can even blind you. And the surviving man recalled that one of his friends had indeed complained of sudden blindness just moments before collapsing, while the fishy smell of chemicals still hung thick in the air. The woman in our next case also consumed something strange, only this time it wasn't a drink, but a so-called meal. When doctors opened up 17-year-old Rachel Hayes' stomach during emergency surgery, they were met with the discovery that they'd never seen before. A dense, matted mass nearly 30 centimeters long, tangled like a dead animal, and it was made entirely of human hair. Rachel had suffered from trichophagia, a compulsive disorder where people eat their own hair. And over the years, strand by strand, she had swallowed enough to form a giant trichobazar, a hairball so massive it completely filled her stomach. Doctors eventually removed it, and at first the surgery even seemed successful. However, the massive hairball had been irritating her stomach lining for years. So just days after the operation, internal bleeding began, and ultimately Rachel died on New Year's Day in 1999. Ironically, throughout all this, the girl had worked as a hairdresser, and she actually loved her job. The man from the next case, in turn, loved tricks, especially a certain favorite, which one day went fatally wrong. In 1998, at a house party in Ohio, 23-year-old Michael Gentner took a dare from his friends: swallow a live 13-centimeter fish, and he didn't hesitate, since this wasn't the first time he'd done it at parties like these. So Michael tilted his head back, popped the wriggling fish into his mouth, and forced it down his throat. However, this time the fish didn't go quietly. Deep in his throat, it began thrashing, twisting, and eventually got stuck halfway down his windpipe. Michael suddenly stumbled, gasping and clutching at his neck. His friends started screaming in panic as his face turned blue. They didn't understand what was happening until one of them noticed something truly horrifying. The tail of the fish was sticking out of his mouth, twitching weakly. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but by then it was already too late. The fish had entirely blocked his airway, and eventually Michael had suffocated to death. The man in our next case also underestimated an animal, but in his case, it was much, much bigger. In July 2024, a 43-year-old Spanish tourist stepped away from a safari vehicle with a smartphone in his hand. Just a few meters ahead, a herd of elephants grazed under the African sun, with calves nestled close to their mothers. Chasing the perfect shot, the man ignored his fiance's pleas and the guide's repeated warnings. Nor was he deterred by the numerous warning signs around Pilanesberg National Park, all clearly screaming one exact thing: stay in the vehicle. Still, the man kept walking, closer and closer. And while elephants are generally calm animals, they can be easily provoked if they sense a threat, especially to their young. So at first, one of the females simply stared at the uninvited guest. But everything changed in an instant when her calf ran up beside her. Suddenly, she twitched, stomped, and let out a thunderous trumpet. Seconds later, the entire herd surged forward, charging straight toward the man, who now desperately tried to run. But out on the open savanna, he didn't stand a chance against a stampede of giants weighing over 3,600 kilograms each. So eventually, the elephants caught up and trampled him to death right in front of his fiancée. This case is a striking example of how blatantly reckless behavior can lead to an absurd death, one that could have easily been avoided if he had just stayed in the safari vehicle, and the next man could have saved his life just as easily, if only he'd fastened his seatbelt. 39-year-old Ivan Segedin from Wanganui, New Zealand, lived by one absurd personal rule: never wear a seatbelt. Over the years, he'd racked up more than 30 fines for refusing to buckle up, part of his ongoing crusade against what he called government overreach. Yet eventually, tired of the endless penalties but still determined to defy the rules, Ivan came up with a workaround. He crafted a fake seatbelt from fabric, looped it over his shoulder, and knotted it in place so that, from outside the vehicle, it looked like he was wearing one. And for a while, it seemed to work. Police indeed stopped issuing fines. However, something far worse was waiting down the road. On the evening of July 22, 2007, Ivan's car veered into the path of an oncoming vehicle and ended up in a brutal head-on collision. Without a real seatbelt, he was violently thrown forward, slamming into the steering wheel with his chest and then into the dashboard with his skull. The man was killed instantly on impact, and the coroner later addressed his grieving family with one devastatingly simple phrase: had he worn a real seatbelt, he may have survived. In our final case, a young woman also kept pushing back, stubbornly defiant to the very end. And eventually, she paid the ultimate price as well. It was the final month of 1869 in rural Carmarthenshire, Wales. And across the country, whispers were spreading about a so-called miracle girl. 12-year-old Sarah Jacob had become a national fascination. A child who, according to her deeply religious parents, hadn't eaten anything in over a year. Newspapers declared her a wonder. Curious visitors flocked to the family's farmhouse just to see her lying quietly in bed, pale and still, supposedly nourished only by divine intervention. But behind the holy headlines, something was deeply wrong. Doctors, unconvinced by the story, proposed a test. Sarah would be placed under round-the-clock medical surveillance, completely without food, but constantly observed. As the days passed, Sarah, once alert, began to grow weak. She stopped smiling, then speaking, and eventually moving. After 8 days, she was ultimately pronounced dead. it became painfully clear that the so-called miracle had been a lie, and that Sarah had been secretly eating before the doctors arrived. But the consequences were far too real, both for her and her parents, who were later convicted of manslaughter after being found guilty of letting their daughter waste away, all because they refused to admit the obvious truth. These 13 stories are so absurd, yet inexplicably real. You'd think they were ripped from the pages of a dark comedy, and yet every single one of them actually happened. From flying cows to handmade cocktails turned deadly, these cases prove that sometimes fate can be ridiculously cruel. But more often than not, it strikes hardest at those who set the stage for disaster themselves. Now let me ask you, which of these accidents felt the most unbelievably dumb? And have you ever come this close to something ridiculous and dangerously real? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking, real-life stories, the kind that might just make you think twice before turning life into a tragic comedy of your own.